Hi, it's Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and I thought I would do a video on my trip to Canberra. I decided after I got a little bit of extra money to go for a drive to Canberra to see my mother. It was really a tribute to her. It's Mother's Day, and I wanted her to know that I was grateful for her support in my life because I'm in a homeless capacity, and I have found that there isn't a great deal of support for those of us in this situation. It's highly stigmatised. It's more stigmatised than mental health in actual fact, and often it encompasses mental health because when people are isolated from their society or their family or from work, they develop mental health issues. And of course that then isolates them even more from their society. I'm not having mental health issues because I'm a peacemaker and I know how to transmute negativity. However, I'm having the experience of what it's like to be on the margins of society, to be without a permanent income, to be without a home, and to have no assets. It's a very fascinating space to live in because it's filled with uncertainty, and it's typically the place most people don't want to go. It's what keeps them all working on that treadmill. But my purpose of my discussion today is to really talk about homelessness. I had an experience where I met with someone who had always wanted to help the homeless, and she and I met, and I said to her I wanted to do something for homeless people too. And really, as a homeless person said to me, I'm not homeless, I just don't have a house, and I would agree with that. I typically use the terminology of homeless because that's the one that's used as the label. But when I write poetry, I tend to italicize or put in italics the less. So you've got homeless with italics because inherent within the word homeless is less. And really the societal response to homelessness is that the person is less and they're afraid on some level of their desperation, or they're fearful that they might be on drugs or they might be violent. So these are the most vulnerable people because of these stigmas. I had the experience in Canberra to actually start something. The woman that I met had been in the welfare sector. She was a Christian. She was willing to support an initiative that I created, which was called Homeless Lives Matter. That came to me in inspiration, actually, and I realised it was connected with Black Lives Matter. They're all in respect of discriminations on the basis of beliefs that are unquestioned. Some of them are so normalised that people don't even realise the depth of the discrimination that they may well be projecting as they walk past. And I would also include myself as one of those who walked past. So there's no holier than thou sitting here going, you should all stop and help the homeless, because I also walk past. But I would say this, that I've never felt comfortable doing it. And in London, when I saw lots of people in the London Underground, I saw my friends step over their feet, and I remember thinking, I'll never be like that. I'm never going to get used to it, and I don't want to get used to it. So isn't it funny? Maybe clearly there was some form of life purpose in respect of the homeless in my own life, and myself becoming homeless was good because I see them as my people now, which I'm really happy about. I don't want to create a distance. I want to get to know them because they are equal. And I'm a person, I've gone through my life where I've faced a lot of fear. I'm not one for backing away from, I wouldn't say a fight, because that's what typically people say. It's never to do with a fight, but I typically won't back away from things I'm afraid of. I may feel the fear and do it anyway, like to stand my ground. But I really believe life is about an experience. I don't think it's about hiding in one's house or just getting a job and burying your head in the sand and hoping it all goes away. It doesn't. It actually comes back to you in some other form. So anyway, this lady got behind me and I wrote a press release which I'll attach to this video just so that you know a little bit about it. What we discussed, and this is an idea I've had for a while, I know about the design of Canberra by Walter Burley Griffin and his wife Marion. They were both architects from Chicago in the United States, in actual fact. So they won the competition to design Canberra. And the reason Canberra exists is because there was a bit of a fight between Melbourne and Sydney, and they ended up opting for a place in between. Now, the beautiful thing about the word Canberra is it actually means meeting place. So it is an appropriate name. It's an Indigenous name, but it means meeting place. So placing the country's parliament in this location is very fitting. It's a very beautiful energy in Canberra. I grew up there, and you can feel it in the land. So one of my ideas was to go to City Hill, because I realised when I did some research on Walter Burley Griffin that City Hill was part of the parliamentary triangle, and it was the People's Hill. And I didn't know that. I didn't even know that people had a hill. People would say it's Parliament. But these days I'm not seeing Parliament as the People's Hill. I'm seeing City Hill as the People's Hill, because I think the people have lost their voice. Bit of laryngitis. No, we don't have laryngitis. We're not heard, you know. So anyway, one of my other ideas, and I'll just quickly drop this in, was to walk to Canberra. I had this idea after I became homeless. I also had a dream too. I remember I dreamed of a person called Pilgrim, and you might want to look her up. She's a very interesting American woman, in actual fact. She walked across the United States 7 times penniless. And she was a peacemaker like me, but far, far more connected in respect of peace. She had deep inner peace. It took her 15 years to develop it. She said she had highs and lows on her journey, but she committed herself to peace. So she put herself into service in the society. So she just went and helped people. She lived where need equals want. She relinquished work and just served. She said that she still battled some of her thoughts, and in the end she had what some might call a peak experience, and she never ever had a down moment from that point on. So she awakened is probably the more modern way of describing what happened to her. So I'd read one of her books, very inspiring. I became a vegetarian as a result of reading her work. She completely dedicated to peace. She would lay down anywhere and not feel the rocks. She was completely relaxed. She had a mantra going on in her head to do with love over fear, I think good over hate, or there was 3 mantras that she used. I can't quite remember them now. But nonetheless, she was transforming in her mind as she walked. It was like a walking meditation. So anyway, I dreamed that I was talking to people about doing a walk to Canberra. And I remember in the dream, it was inspired by her, because I was talking about Peace Pilgrim in my dream. I did try to initiate it in Melbourne, but I didn't get any support. But nonetheless, that idea of City Hill came to me at that point. So when I got to Canberra, met this lady, started that press release, City Hill had to become the symbolic start point, if you like, of this Homeless Lives Matter. So she and we went to a library, and I developed a few I tried to get Twitter going, but that didn't really work. I don't have a phone either. I was given an Optus phone by my mum, but I can't use it because of the surveillance that I'm experiencing, which is not as a result of doing anything wrong. It's more because I've spoken up about my conscientious objection to the rorting in the job provider system, and that's put me under a bit of a spotlight. As a result of that, I can't ring many people. I can't ring anyone, actually, unless I use a friend's phone. Surveillance is on the phone because I saw the word surveillance, and I've also had US surveillance too, unfortunately, whereas I'd much rather sit down and talk with them. They prefer surveillance because they see people unfortunately, speaking up as some form of dissent rather than part of a democratic discourse that we have to actually face our society. And if society has complaints, you've got to take on board those complaints without demonising that person. I'm also a trainer in anti-bullying, so I see these things as part of intimidation, not really seeking to solve the problem, which is why problems escalate. Problems can easily be de-escalated if people sit down and talk. But unfortunately, we've still got, if you like, beliefs in control rather than sharing power through dialogue. And that's the way of it. So anyway, going back to this project, this lady and I, we went to the city, and I was very shocked to see all the cameras everywhere because I've just awakened to smart cities, and I've realised that they've got cameras everywhere. And I grew up in Canberra, and there was nothing like this when I was a child. And I don't believe the threats are worse today. You know, we had a Vietnam War back then when I was growing up, and Korean War. There's always been conflicts around the world. The war on terror would be low-level conflict in respect of grievances with specific groups that have been projected through the media as, you know, major problems in countries. But certainly Australia's, I would say, is a very safe country still, although that might change if we continue on trajectories that escalate conflict. We have to learn how to resolve conflict and to make friends with our neighbours. Same applies in the homeless area. It's really about people dialoguing with the homeless, and rather than judging them and demonising them and isolating them, we need to look at more positive approaches to include people so that they're not left out in the cold, literally. So when I was in the city, I sat with homeless people. It was a really great experience for me because as soon as I sat on the ground with them and told them I'd also been homeless for 2 years, which it has been, it was June 14, 2 years ago that I became homeless, their whole attitude changes. It's really incredible. They open up. So they don't see you as someone who's just giving them money and feeling sorry for them. When you sit on the ground with them and say, yeah, well, I know how it feels. I know how you feel. You get their expression changes as they start to look at you as an equal. It's really interesting. It's fascinating. Anyway, I've met quite a lot of people, so I'll just reflect some of the meetings I had. I met with an older man. He was wearing a Carew hat, very good-looking man, actually. He would have been in his 60s. Grandfather. He didn't believe in burdening his children. I believe he'd been on the land. I think he's also, I'm not quite sure if he said he'd been in the military, but he got dengue fever. And he said he has a lung problem. He's got a problem with his health. He came back to Canberra because he grew up here, but he'd been in Queensland, and I think he got dengue fever up there from a mosquito bite. So he came back to Canberra, and there he was sitting on the street, this older man, and he said to me he had a car and he had a licence and he sleeps in his car. But gee, he was such a lovely man. I really liked him a lot, actually. And he just told me a bit about his family, and he was okay, but what worried me was what happens when the weather gets colder and he's got a lung problem. You know, he's not going to get, because we discussed his health and he said it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And there he was sitting there. That was very sad, actually. I met a young man, a 21-year-old. I just happened to be going to a church because I'd been advised by a friend of mine that they dealt with the homeless, so I wanted to connect with homeless people. I want to do a walk to Parliament House was part of the initiative that I'd come up with. another part of the initiative was to go onto City Hill and walk as a walking meditation for the homeless, to imagine what it's like to walk in their shoes. That was the idea. You'll see it in the press release that I'll attach to this. Anyway, this young man and I was just briefly trying to figure out where the entrance was to the church. And he and I just got talking. And he said, oh, yeah, he's homeless. And I said, what happened? And he goes, oh, my mother kicked me out. She said he used some expletives about his mum. He didn't get on with her. He said she was very controlling. She was also on drugs. And they had conflict. She had a partner. I don't think he got on with the partner. He also acknowledged to me that he wanted to suicide. And I said, I understand that. I've been there. I've also wanted to end my life many times. And I said, what it is powerlessness. You feel powerless and you've had enough. A lot of people feel that. It's actually not it's not unnatural to want to end your life, to be honest, I don't think. I think it's a natural response to feeling no exit, feeling powerless. And toxic cultures produce powerlessness in people where they don't feel they've got a voice, they don't feel understood, they feel excluded, they're undermined. This is all toxic culture stuff, and we're living in one. It's normalised because people don't know what a healthy culture actually is like. Certainly in Australia, there's been a lot of hardship here, but getting caught up in the whole economic paradigm has meant people haven't had time for each other. People are not going to have time to sit and talk with a young 21-year-old. Anyway, he said he had stepped away from the society. He doesn't want any bar of it. He doesn't want a bar of it. So he's quite isolated. He's sleeping at the church there. And he said that when he was at his mother's, he said drones went over. He believes they were police drones. He did ring the police about that, and they said it was to do with traffic control. He doesn't think so. He said it was above his house. So there's issues for society in respect of the use of drones. Do we really want to be followed? Now, the reason he had this situation happen was because he was on bail, and he had been at a pub. He had been verbally abused by someone who was drunk, and being a young man and a hothead, he hit that man, and then he was arrested for that. I talked to him a bit about non-violence, and I said there's a great power in not hitting back. I studied Gandhi when I was doing peace studies at a university, and I said to him, when you're hitting back, it's because you're feeling hurt and you're wanting to hurt that other. Verbal abuse will catalyse violence. I said also the man was drunk and he was probably venting a lot of his own frustration at life on you. He was projecting. So I tried to inform him a little bit about how to manage his anger. It put him in a situation where he was on bail, but he said under those terms apparently of the bail, he was not able to access a shelter, which I found quite a punitive response by the court. He's a vulnerable person. I don't know if there was more to his history because obviously I'm not privy to it. But nonetheless, even if there is more to his history, you shouldn't be preventing him from accessing homeless shelter. He had rotten teeth. Now, it could be to do with either poor health or it could be to do with drugs. I'd say he would have been taking drugs. Many of them do because they are trying to soothe the pain that they're feeling. They're all in emotional pain is what we're dealing with here. It's not about a house, which is one of my statements. Home is where the heart is. They're troubled and wound up in these situations because they can't go back to what was once a home or a house. Not all families are homes. So anyway, we talked for a fair while and I gave him a hug. I invited him to come on this walk to Parliament. He didn't come, but that's not surprising to me. Many of them don't feel they want to be part of anything anymore. You know, they're disconnecting. I went into the city and I met, another young couple. I would say they were about 17, 18. Young girl had said her mother had died 6 months before, and her mother was her best friend, she said. She'd met this young man, and I could see he had, sort of facial complaint. His eyes were black. I don't know whether that was from fighting or what. Anyway, they fell in love, and that was a good thing. They talked about life on the street to me and said that people tried to break them up because they were jealous of the fact that they had love, because many of them don't have love. See, like any group, any community, there's problems. People get into fights and they undermine each other, and I know that there was stealing in that particular community of homeless people. This young girl said that she'd been given $11,000 from her mum's estate, I'm assuming, and she said as soon as people on the street knew she had money, they stood over her and they got the money, so she lost all of it. She said that the mother's ex-partner, or partner he would have been, he came and he lit all their gear. He put it on fire. They said that they'd been camping up on City Hill, which I thought was interesting. I'd actually had an idea to camp overnight, a few nights there, but that didn't eventuate. It's actually a very peaceful place on City Hill. I really like the energy there. It actually, if you sit, there's a little sort of bench that you can sit on, and it sits right in front of the new Parliament. You can see the pyramid of the new Parliament. You can sit there and reflect on, democracy and politics and what that is. I've done that. I did that while I was up there. In my own way, sending light to those who are in a form of darkness, I feel. And the whole society is also reflecting that negativity. Canberra was a very friendly place to grow up in. I actually enjoyed growing up in Canberra. Conflicts in the families. Our family was no different from most. We don't know how to resolve conflict, which was probably what was the incentive for me to become a peacemaker. I always knew that dialogue was the way, but it's very hard to dialogue when people are fighting a lot. They've got a lot of problems that they're not resolving. See, resolution is not just a nice little catchy buzzword that we just talk about in conflict resolution. You have to resolve your conflict if you want it to go. Now, you can't necessarily even just go through processes. There have to be emotional releases around conflict. So it's not an intellectual exercise. You can't force others to turn up in a way that makes you feel good in order to call that a resolution. It's not. We hear about resolutions in the international arena. They're not. They're negotiations. People trade off this and that because they see it as a business deal. It's not. We're all human beings, and we need to learn how to work through our negative feelings, which are all projections and none of them are true. We're in a lot of ignorance around each other. Once you stand in the shoes of another, which is a typical terminology in conflict resolution, you start to feel what they might feel. You get an experience. And what I've certainly learned from homelessness is until you've had the lived experience, you don't know it. And that's no disrespect to those in the industry or the area. It's turning into an industry of homelessness. No disrespect. You just can't know what it's like until you personally have confronted it. It really is known to those of us who've been there. And that's why those voices have to be heard in the parliamentary area, in politics. We can't have people who have had no idea, organising policy or writing up legislation around homelessness. It's got to be dealt with. I would call it, from an economics perspective, it's an externality. It's a negative externality that's come out of a system that's unable to firstly provide full employment, but it's not only that, it's the breakdown of the family, which has occurred because of the working hours, the materialism that's distracted us from each other. The actual system itself is breaking down the family. I know that from having studied economics. I get it. I was a market analyst for 10 years. I used to do research into consumer behaviour. And it was really all about sending out messages to people to consume more, particularly of your product, and to find out what their needs were and how that could be enticed through marketing communications. A lot of what we're seeing in the media these days is PR spin, public relations, that means, and, you know, marketing strategies to say things in a way that attracts people. But I think really what the people are needing is more authentic communication that's real. There's been too much deception, and really we live mostly in deception in our world. So going back to the young man, the young couple, I should say, they looked dishevelled. The young man was on drugs. His girlfriend was saying that he likes drugs. So that's going to be a part of that relationship. And of course, drugs is a fake sense of feeling good. It's not real. What many of those young people don't know is if they stopped for 3 days, it actually moves out of the body. What's interesting, I learned this recently, that the addiction, how it's created is the cells of the body, every cell, experiences the introduction into the body of a foreign substance. Because we're adaptable, and we are adaptable in ways that's really quite astounding, the cells adapt to the new substance and include it in, you could call it, the vibration of the body. Now, that feeling of craving is to do with the cells having adapted to that new substance. And then in order to keep homeostasis in the body then craves that substance to keep it in a state of balance. Isn't that interesting? I learned that just recently, and I just thought that makes a lot of sense. That's why we get addictions, is because the body's actually adapted to the new substance. And in order to keep its balance, it doesn't know if it's good or bad, it just knows it's keeping its balance. It then craves it. But if you stop it for 3 days, the addiction will go. It's where the discipline comes in. But many of them stay with it because they can't find any good feeling thoughts to replace the drug. That's the real issue of drugs. You can criminalize it, you can put them in jail, you can ban, you know, various substances, but you're not dealing with the core problem, which is they don't feel good. And the reason they don't feel good is because they've come from hardship, from broken families. They feel bad about themselves. One man, I talked to another homeless person, told him I was also homeless, and he said to me a little bit about his life, and he was without income. And I said, you're a good man. And he goes, no, I'm not. And I said, I looked into your eyes and I see that you're a good man, and I can see that. And I did, and he was. But he was down on himself. He felt really bad about life. We talked a little bit about the election, and, you know, he had his views. It was very interesting. They're just ordinary people, really. Some of them are rough around the edges. I met a few Indigenous people. Not because they were rough around the edges, they're actually very gentle. I found them to be gentle. I met a man who didn't look Indigenous but said he was. He was with another Indigenous man who had that Aboriginal look about him. Beautiful men. Oh, my God. I was so surprised at how lovely they are. And one had done a literary degree. He had a great knowledge of all the literary works. And I told him what I was doing. I wanted to, do this walking meditation, wanted to go to Parliament. And he was really lovely. He ended up meeting up with us the next day, he and his friend, and we did some posters on homeless don't vote, talked about the Universal Declaration of the human rights for Social Security, the right to have shelter, things like that. This was all part of my press release as well. There are universal articles around, living in dignity really in a society. And those universal declarations of human rights, they call it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was actually passed after the Second World War. Eleanor Roosevelt, the US president, Eleanor Roosevelt's wife, was the one who crafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's an excellent document. I mean, some in the East say that it doesn't deal with group rights, but they've misunderstood it. It's not to say it's all about the individual, but ultimately every person has a right, and they are unique, despite the fact they might belong to groups, which they all do anyway. So it's not really about groups and individuals. It's really about human rights for each person to live in a state of dignity. It's really about our civilization, being civilized. See, the Second World War was full of carnage. What was it, 50 million that died or more? And, of course, the Holocaust in amongst all that. And we've had Holocausts since, in Rwanda. And there have been lots of conflicts in Africa, lots of human rights violations around the world where we're not respecting one another, where various competing interests are getting precedence over others. And if they've got money, money talks. This is the corruption. That's how it, in a sense, thrives in an environment where money is the only arbitrator. We're losing our judicial neutrality as courts become businesses, and then they too succumb to influencers who are powerful. And that's how you break down a democratic society, and that's what's happening. So the poorest of the poor, the homeless, are the ones that really feel this breakdown, because they're the ones that need the protections more than anyone. Everyone has the right to shelter. And when you're in a first world country, I mean, if you're in a war zone, everybody's suffering together. But when you're in a first world country that's got plenty of money and you're seeing buildings being erected around them, it's clearly not a money issue. It's a judgment issue. It's a stigmatizing issue. It's punitive issue, because that homeless person is seen as being blamed for their situation, because the society or the leadership will not face the fact that economic conditions have caused that. They won't honestly face and solve that problem. They certainly can do it. 116,000 people would be easy to house. You've got plenty of money. We've got billions going on all sorts of areas that are not a high priority. There's also private-public partnerships where they're actually raising money through private investors. But the private investors won't be interested in the homeless because they're considered non-productive assets, and that's the breakdown of capitalism. Capitalism breaks that down. Democracy is a philosophy that is saying that that system is representation of the people by the people. So it's supposed to be a system where the people are, through these representatives, collecting taxes in order to ensure that the people have their needs met. The capitalist system is a system that's grown, really since mercantilism, 17th century, 18th century, 16th century. It's been around a long time. Trading companies. Once we moved out of barter and into agriculture and, primitive forms of industrialisation at the turn of the 19th century, where they started to organise production processes. They were in more linear styles. Then the Japanese sort of invented more automated manufacturing equipment, where they created what was called islands of automation. So these were robots building parts of a particular product. Could be a car. You've seen footage probably of that. And people, we've had many periods where there's been employment or close to full. Probably the 60s would have been our high point. Then we had the oil shocks in the 70s, and we had concentration of wealth developing through the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then we had Yeah, there has been foreign interference, of course. We can all say that we're sovereign, we're not. Unfortunately, our world has been governed by power, not democracy. Democracy has been used, but it's not been truly integrated. And it's a shame that that's happened, because real stability comes from participation and inclusivity. It's not going to come from control paradigms. That's only going to polarise society more, and then it becomes an us against them, which is very much a tragedy. We somehow need to evolve to some point where we start to see another as ourselves, where our environment becomes our inner environment. If you're not at peace within, you're obviously going to be grasping for things, for material things. Certainly in the homeless area, they're not at peace. Although I met one that was, I'll tell you his story. He was interesting. He was fair, and I said, well, where are you from? He goes, India. I went, really? I said, you don't look like you're from India. He was quite overweight. He wasn't hungry. And he was drying his shorts. He'd just done some washing. This was in Canberra. It was very funny. Right near the Legislative Assembly for the ACT government. He was sitting right on the steps, right near there. I might just give a quick allude. There's actually a statue in front of the Legislative Assembly, and it's, what was it, Erot? Just trying to think of the name of the female. It was a female statue, Ethos, I think it was called. And it was a woman that was depicting community, and there was all symbolism etched into her gown, and it gave the impression of a community. She was also holding, if you can imagine, let's do it like that. Can't really get a light here. There was a sun over her head, enlightenment. I actually had a talk with another woman. It was a little bit not really wanting to have a chat. I said, she's about community. I said, that's why I approached you. And she might think, oh, why is she approaching me? Because we all get a bit suspicious when someone comes up and starts to chat in a friendly way. We think, what do they want? I didn't want anything. I just was sharing. I'm often like that. So going back to our Indian man, yeah, he'd been abandoned at 2 on the streets in India. I can't remember what city. Maybe it was New Delhi. It was New Delhi. I've been to New Delhi. So his normal was homelessness. He actually had never lived in our family. And he sat there and he said, oh, I'm happy. I said, are you warm enough? Because he had a bag full of, must have been blankets. I said, are you warm enough? He goes, yeah, I'm fine. He said, I make money. I said, how much do you make? He goes, 200 a week. I actually didn't think that was much, but he's got no rent. So he said, I don't ask for it. He said, people just see me sitting there and they give me money. And I thought, good on you, Canberra. Canberra's always been very, very generous. I do remember that. But I was happy he was happy, and I just said, I'm really happy for you. This was a lifestyle choice. Fair enough. He's not begging. He's actually been given money, and he's living from a space of what's normal for him. He didn't want the responsibility of rent. I can understand that. And interestingly enough, when you do find yourself homeless and you don't pay rent, it's amazing how cheap life is. So we've created through economics expensive lives that I question whether that needs to be the case. So I also have met a few women with mental health issues. One had a form of schizophrenia, I think, actually split personality. She told me she'd been involved in pedophilia and as a child. She'd also, in her early life, experienced rape from a man who was her mother's boyfriend. See, we've got these step parents that are really problematic. Now, she and her sister looked alike, she said, and she was 7 at the time. And I really hate talking about this because this particularly disturbs me. He raped her, and then he thought he was raping her sister, but it was her. I don't know how she fooled him, but They must have looked alike. So she decided to protect her sister. I mean, how brave is that? She said he was very big. She split her personality in order to escape the pain. And that's what happens often. She was part of a pedophile ring too later on. We didn't really get into that because I was sitting on the street with her, and she was revealing to me that she'd had horrendous life. And she herself, at that point where I was meeting her, was a mother. She had 20-year-olds. And her children were not involved with her, I don't think. Or her children didn't live in Canberra. I can't quite remember what happened to the kids because I'm always concerned about where are your children and why aren't they helping. I think many of them kind of want to be alone. They try to disconnect a bit from the family. It's probably shame and trying to work things out. So she'd had a horrendous life, and she was with a man. They were on the street together, and he would have been, I reckon, late 50s. She would have been mid-40s, I would say. And there they were on the street raising some money. They were going to move in together, she said. But you don't know how it's all going to go. But he seemed to love her, and she felt protected. I found out from other homeless women that they tend to congregate around the homeless men because they're trying to feel safe. One woman said she was the one who said that the women are not safe on the street. They're not safe. And I'd completely agree with that. Another woman I sat with who was talking to herself, she was just repeating, oh, they've come to my house. Oh, they're throwing me out in the house. I was naked. Oh, my God, they're treating me like a child, and she kept repeating. So I was saying, oh, that must have been terrible that you were treated like a child. She goes, yes, it was terrible. And I said, so they're coming to your house? She goes, yeah, they come to my house. They're coming to my house. And she talked like that. It was a little bit like a bit of autism. I don't know. Whatever it was, she was disturbed, but she was intelligent too. And I said to her, you're very intelligent. She goes, yes, I'm intelligent. Talk to her about happiness. Oh, I'm not happy. Oh, happiness? No happiness. And I was sort of trying to put words to her to see what words might touch her, reach her. I was trying to reach her. But when I looked at her, I wasn't looking at her as, oh, she's crazy. I had no judgment at all in my mind. I was looking actually really into her eyes. When I was a clown, I used to clown on the streets. I've always done that. I don't see the outer. I'm looking at the person. I feel them deeply. So when I'm sitting with them, I'm sitting as an equal, and I'm not sitting as in the position of superiority. I'm sitting in the position of, how do I reach you? I'm looking beyond the facade. Another man I want to tell you about too, who was probably the one that affected me the most, was a man who had a trolley full of clothes. He was really vulnerable, and he was, rocking. Pardon the expression I've got, but that's the expression he had. It was, he was almost like cerebral palsy. I'm not an expert in these matters, so I don't know what sort of condition he had. But it was ticking and, but when I talked to him, I sat again with him, told him I was homeless, and I looked into his eyes, and I'm looking to see them. I'm not concerned with ticking and all that sort of stuff. And I was inviting him to come with us. He was extremely isolated and extremely fearful. I really liked him. When I looked into his eyes, I really liked him. I could see him. And I made a mistake. I said to him, and I didn't mean to, but I'm inexperienced. And I said, why are you ticking? And with that, he got up, grabbed his stuff, and he went. And the reason I asked that was really to just acknowledge that it was happening. maybe that was very foolish of me and he got embarrassed. Or maybe he didn't want to go into any story around that and he just left. And I saw how frightened he was. And I was just so sorry. There was nothing I could say to him, and off he went. I met a lot of them and I didn't feel frightened of them, and I didn't feel alienating. And it was kind of surreal because there I am, I'm looking like me, and I'm with them as my people. And yet the Australian people walking past are my people too. I can easily slip into that group. I could sit on a seat at a board meeting, and although I would find the homeless much more friendly, some of them that I've met have been so friendly and kind, really quick to help. I was so amazed at the guys who helped put the posters up around City Hill. One of them came along with us, too, actually, a friend of his as well, came and walked to Parliament with us. And I had a sign about homeless don't vote. Homeless no vote, I think I had on my sign. And the other guy had a sign, but he wasn't really showing it. It was only a couple of us walking along Northbourne Avenue there up to Parliament. And we came, you can't kind of walk straight up to Parliament on the pathway because it's a circle around Parliament. So we ended up going around near the old Parliament House, and I reflected on that. They were the days. The People's House was far more approachable. Today they'd have cameras everywhere. So we walk up there, and I had to go to the loo. So I had to do it. I had to go behind a tree. Yes, I'm confessing that. But there was no loos. It was Saturday. I found out later when we got to Parliament that there was loos up there. I didn't know that. Nature called. So I just was hoping in that moment there was no cameras. I thought, what if they are infrared? It's a bit embarrassing. And I just thought, oh well, if it is, it is. But we walked up. There was a 7 film crew there, Channel 7, and they were preparing their boom, and they had the lights on Parliament there. It was getting dark when we were up there, and they were organising that for election night, which was the following night. And I had a chat with one of the techs, producer probably, and just told him that we were homeless and we'd walked up because homelessness don't have a voice. And I said, basically, if you don't have a voice if you're not heard, we're not heard. And I just started to feel sad, and they were looking at their screens, and I was just looking at the technology, and I'm thinking, this is the problem, is the technology. It's like they're looking at the screens. They've got a person behind them who's homeless. The normal reaction should be to actually, respond to that person with love and kindness. But we're so mesmerised by our technology. The men can be very detached. I really find that. And it's really disappointing because they're not seeing the real story. They're looking at life through this lens that's not the real life. And they've got their agendas, and, they think these things are important. They're not. The homeless are important. It's a national tragedy. 116,000 plus without a home in a wealthy country. I mean, surely that's got to be the subject of discussion. I did talk to a man actually in the city when I passed out some brochures, and he said he and his father do talk about it, actually. He said, we're very concerned. And I said, well, come on the walk with us. He didn't come, but he probably was working, I would say. But who knows? Maybe I'll get an email from him. So harking back to Parliament, it was dark and there was the water feature in front of the Parliament. I've been in there many times before. I've actually sat in the House of Reps and the Senate, deeply contemplating what this place is about. I've heard question time, unimpressed. They were all fighting and carrying on, thinking it was acceptable behaviour. So I sat on the ground. I've done a lot of sitting on the ground over this time. And I just focused on Parliament, reflecting and feeling the disconnect, feeling they don't hear us. I actually felt quite down as I was sitting there, and I was just thinking, you know, what a shame. You know, it's not the people's house. I'm just going to sit with that for a moment, because that was it was a sad moment for me, in actual fact. People don't care, you know, they're not caring, they're indifferent. That indifference comes from that closed heart. Closed heart, closed mind. That's a reality. What I noticed was it was empty all around it. There was no people there, obviously. It was the election eve. But I felt the emptiness of the place. It's a pyramid structure, but it's an empty. There's no content to it. Symbolically, I can see the emptiness. The old Parliament House had a lot of character, and if you talk to anyone that was around the old Parliament House, they would say that it was very lively and people came in and out. It's not this paranoia or fear of terrorism. We're not really, I don't believe there's great threat here. Australia's a safe country, but it's going to increasingly become more unsafe the more we go on about terrorism. What you think about, you bring about. This is the law of attraction. I want people who are watching this, and I'm sure there'll be some intelligence people looking. What you think about, you bring about. So if you keep focusing on terrorism, look for the terrorists. If you become like McCarthyism, out those evil others, let's find them. Let's, through cyber security, let's pick up those keywords. And I know as a market analyst, you're bound to get it wrong, because electronic surveillance might pick up the words, but you don't know the context, you don't know the people. You might well have profiles, which I'm sure you will. But nonetheless, people do silly things, people say silly things. It doesn't necessarily mean they're a threat, it just might mean they're venting. Does that solve the problem? Do we put a watch on them because we think they might be dangerous, or do we actually embrace in the very dialogue, which is the basis of a democracy? You know, really, that's the line in the sand I think that's been drawn now. And we can continue down those same trajectories. Maybe we need to go down that path of a surveillance state, far worse than communist Russia, far worse. I went to Vietnam and saw the little Politburos on the corner, you know, where they would have been watching the citizens. And in China, of course, it's getting right out of hand with the cyber surveillance there and their social credit system. If you comply, you're a good social citizen. If you don't, you lose credits and they'll probably cut you off. Now we've got smart meters. I could easily go on about this one. Get cut off if you don't comply. And I believe, you know, that's still coming from that old authoritarian, you know, domination type projection, which never really found itself comfortable with democracy, which is really sitting around the table. And I know no one really grew up in democracy in their home. You know, there was always the, authority from parents, and we all did as we're told. So we've pretty much been programmed down that track. But we lose the creativity, we lose the innovation, we lose a great deal from control paradigms. It really stifles the expansion of humanity into its most highest form. So what you think about, you bring about. The more you focus on the terrorism, the more you're going to attract it. You're going to upset Muslims, and we've got the biggest Muslim archipelago in the world to our north. It's extremely unwise. You know, I noted that Tony Abbott has stepped out of Parliament. I remembered his narrative as Prime Minister. He talked a lot about terrorism. The Conservative view, the media influence, the militarism and all that tends to all be rolled up into that ideological narrative. it comes from a base of fear, not possibility, which is really what we create as we use the contrast in life, which is the differences in life, to catapult us forward into better expressions of who we are. It's not about shutting down what's different. It's not about forcing people to conform to worldviews that's really not them. It's more to embrace that diversity, inclusive of homeless people, and decide and, formulate where we go from here. What is that better future going to look like for the children? Or are a lot of kids going to grow up in poverty? If we're talking artificial intelligence and more automation, which is certainly on the table, what happens to the young ones? They're going to get very despondent if there's very high levels of unemployment. They also will end up on the street. So that tends to run counter to the cyber networking that they're trying to do. It's like you can't be part of that if you haven't got any money, and it only values money. So we're going to the extreme, I think, in capitalism. And, it has no desire to pick up the social problems. It prefers to cast them off or make a market out of them. And that's not how you resolve social ills, which have come from the very system itself. So my journey to Canberra really was a real eye-opener, and I don't regret it. When we walked down from Parliament House, I was walking on the grass and really reflecting, because Canberra really is my city. It's like I grew up with politics. It's very part of who I am. And there was a point in my life where I wanted to go into politics when I was quite young. I was very interested. That's why I went into economics and studied it. I was interested. But I'm not so much interested in the money side of things. I've never been motivated by that. So that's where my diversity is, I guess. I've always liked the people. So as we walked down that hill towards Old Parliament House, we're walking along the path, and there was a bit of road work, so we had to walk on the road a little bit. And a police car came down quite fast and then came around the corner. I'm sure they had a good look at us. And, of course, what went through my mind was facial recognition. Because now they see everyone as a threat. They don't just see it as a democratic right to go and sit at your parliament. They now say, okay, who is it? Identify them, ID. Could be a threat. Well, the only threat you're really likely to confront here is the truth. And if that's threatening, well, there's going to be more of it coming your way, because people will speak up. And maybe Australians need to go through a bit more. So it is what it is. I do actually love everyone. I'm very lucky like that. So I don't sit there feeling resentment, even in my current situation. I just see it as part of my journey. I'm obviously meant to go through this, and I'm meant to speak up. Do with it what you will. We're all equal. We're all in it together. I love the homeless people very much. I can see their pain, and they need healing is what they really need. They also need a minister for homeless. They need someone who's actually looking out for their interests. And at this point, there's no one. They don't really, human services is not effective here. It's not about just shunting them off to homeless shelters. They need healing. We also need to look at the family and the breakdown of the family and the drugs that is penetrating families, because they're not coping. They're simply not coping. So do we discard those who don't cope? Do we discard those who dissent or have a different opinion or who raise conscientious objections? Do we chuck them to the side? Or do we actually show some courage, open the mind, and do it differently? It's not all about self-reliance. We're all interdependent. The economy is not self-reliant. It is interdependent. When we have overseas trade, exports, imports, that's globally interdependent. So the whole notion of self-reliance is a misnomer unless you're going to close all trade to the outside world and do what India did, which was basically it had protection policies in place, and it started to develop its own internal market because it's a big market over there. But even there, it's still interdependent internally on buyers and sellers. So there's no such thing really of self-reliance unless you're able to completely live like a homeless. In fact, the homeless are probably the most self-reliant of all because they've got to find food. They do help each other though, so they're not totally alone. Some might be. They're very resilient. So I'm just saying that things aren't always as they seem, and these mantras that keep getting wheeled out. Give a fair go. Well, are you? In your privileged situation, is that a fair go? Are you inviting Australians into your party, or is it certain groups? In both parties, you're favouring certain groups. You're not open to the whole public. You're not self-reliant. You're taking donations. So you can't be asking people to behave in a certain way when you're not the example of it yourself. That's the hypocrisy in the system. And it's to do with not questioning one's own beliefs and ideologies, just adhering to it and then victim blaming others. So let's drop all that. We've got a new term now, so my hope is that, I don't know, I'm not sure whether something new will come out of all of this, but let's just say it could be business as usual from this point on. But all I can hope for is some enlightened people who might hear my video and act on it. Anyway, take care, much love, and give to the homeless when you see them, because they're not bludgers, they are in great need. Take care, bye.